So, how's Vladimir Putin going to play this one? The killing in the heart of Moscow of one of his generals in charge, the one in charge of chemical weapons. It comes on the eve of the Russian president's traditional marathon end-of-year press conference. Putin so far yet to comment on his country's precipitated drawdown from Syria after the fall of Assad. But he's sure to opine on the death of under-sanctions General Igor Kirillov, what with the arrest of an Uzbek suspect who's confessed to working for Ukraine. Russia may seem exposed and weak, but time's not on Volodymyr Zelensky's side. The Ukrainian president making the rounds at NATO headquarters this Wednesday as the alliance prepares for the return of a Donald Trump who's talked up a deal to end the war, one that could redraw national boundaries in Moscow's favor. Simply put, which is weaker, a Ukraine exhausted by a decade of fighting, or a Russia that's had to pivot to a wartime economy and still ask for Iranian drones and North Korean reinforcements? In the middle, well, there's Europe, divided over how much it's going to have to invest in assistance and defense spending for whatever lies ahead. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, is this an assassination that's a show of audacity or desperation? With us, former French ambassador to Russia, Claude Blanche-Maison. Thank you for being with us.
Bonsoir.
Thanks as well to Samantha Brenzer, an associate fellow at the think tank Chatham House. Good to see you.
Good evening.
And from Washington, John Hardy, Deputy Director of the Russia Program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24 debate after Tuesday's assassination of Igor Kirillov and his top aide, the arrest of a suspect now. Karis Garland has the story.
It was an attack that shattered any semblance of normality in Moscow, even if only briefly. Igor Kirillov, the head of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical protection troops, was killed outside his apartment building on Tuesday, along with his assistant. On Wednesday, officials announced they'd detain a suspect, an Uzbek citizen born in 1995.
During the interrogation, he explained that he'd been recruited by the Ukrainian Special Services. Following their instructions, he arrived in Moscow and received an improvised explosive device. He placed it on an electric scooter, which he parked at the entrance of the apartment building where Igor Kirillov lived.
According to Russian investigators, the suspect set up a camera to monitor Kirillov's movements, then detonated the bomb remotely. They allege he'd been offered $100,000 and residency in a European country as compensation. Ukrainian sources have told several media outlets that Kiev's intelligence service was behind the attack. Ukraine had accused Kirillov of being responsible for the use of chemical weapons against Ukrainian troops, something Moscow denies. Russia has accused Ukraine's Western allies of being complicit in the attack, a claim dismissed by Washington.
It's not something that we were involved in. Obviously, he was a general who was involved in a number of atrocities. He was involved in the use of chemical weapons against Ukrainian military. It's something the United States has publicly assessed before.
Kirillov is the most senior military officer to have been assassinated inside Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Last week, a Russian missile designer, Mikhail Shatsky, was gunned down in a suburban Moscow park. Ukraine did not officially claim responsibility.
Samantha Brenzer, a sequence of events where you have this startling assassination and 24 hours later, quickly an arrest. Your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that the FSB are great at reacting after the fact, but an efficient security service will prevent these kind of attacks from happening. And this is what the FSB does all the time. When there was the Crocus attack, this was the attack on the theater in Moscow over a year ago, they arrested two Central Asians again, two Tajiks this time, after the effect. So they suddenly find these suspects very, very quickly.
Who confess,
who are of Central Asian origin. And this is being talked about a lot in the Russian press, both the official press and in the mill bloggers. So, is this the person who's guilty? I have absolutely no idea. I don't know on what basis they decided to arrest him. But again, this is very convenient and very quick. Why did they allow this to happen in the center of Moscow, in front of an apartment block, in which a very, very highly placed senior general was living? If that is exactly where he was living. We don't know if it was where he was living. So no idea what the arrest is, but if they could find him so quickly, then if I were Putin, I would be very angry with them for not preventing it beforehand.
John Hardy, your thoughts both on the sequence of events and the modus operandi?
Right. I think, as my colleague said, a big question is how did this happen? Another question is, how does this change the mindset of other Russian generals, other elites? If I were another general in Moscow, I'd be looking over my shoulder. That said, I don't think that the assassination will have a great effect on the war effort. Kirillov can be easily replaced. I think you asked about modus operandi, the Ukrainians have had a lot of success, as my colleague noted, and you noted earlier on this program, in assassinating Russian military personnel and different folks in Russia and occupied Ukrainian territory. So just, I think maybe a month ago, a Russian naval officer was assassinated in Crimea. There was famously the daughter of Alexander Dugin assassinated in 2022, and there have been others. So the Ukrainian special services are able to recruit, either infiltrate directly into Russia or recruit people to kind of do their dirty work for them. And so far, the Russians, despite apprehending maybe some suspects before the fact, and of course after, they've not proven highly efficient in thwarting these attacks before they happen.
And I'm not that versed in spyware, but they're not that efficient either. I mean, the Russians have gone after extraterritorially after dissidents, but we haven't seen this kind of spectacular action in Kyiv.
Right. So I think Russian intelligence officers in Ukraine, there have been assassinations and attempts, both through kind of direct action and also missile strikes. I think Russian intelligence in Ukraine is probably more focused on reconnaissance for strikes rather than these sort of attacks. But you definitely have had plots. For example, against Zelensky, there's been maybe even a dozen plots against him. So he says, and against other officials as well. The head of Ukrainian military intelligence has been a target, and his wife was believed to be poisoned, probably by the Russians. So Ukraine is definitely facing the same sort of threat.
Ambassador Blanche-Maison, there's another bit to this timeline, which is just before Ukraine had launched proceedings in absentia against General Kirillov, and they've claimed responsibility. Your thoughts on that?
Absolutely.
Why?
Absolutely. I think both events are a great success for the special forces of Ukraine. Ukraine is more or less stuck on the front where the army people are in fact fighting and with many people killed both sides, and therefore they have to open new fronts. Long time ago they have opened a new front in the Black Sea with a great success, because about a third of the Russian fleet has been sunk and disappeared, in fact, and now they are making this target assassination of people who have something to do with the war in Ukraine. And now, of course, with that, anybody who is somebody in Russia and who has something to do with the war in Ukraine can be threatened by this, because it can happen anywhere, even in the center of Moscow.
And even in the center of Moscow, how worried are they anyway?
Well, I think it's a bit failure for the Russian security. That's why they have to arrest anybody. I mean, either a Tajik or an Uzbek the day after, very quickly, because it's a big failure from their part. I mean, this general should have been protected because he probably knew that he was under threat from some action from the Ukrainian, and there was no protection. After all, the video, which has been channeled by the Ukrainians, show how it happens. He was going out at 6 o'clock from his house with
just his top aide,
his assistant. And nobody was, in front of the door. I mean, he was looking for his car because he had to join an official car. But that's it, no protection at all. I mean, which is very, very, very silly from the Russian security.
All right. And by the way, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, not just anybody. He was under sanctions by the likes of the US, the UK, long accused of what propagandists call mirroring, accusing your rivals of what you intend to do.
Currently, the Russian Defense Ministry has information about a provocation preparation by Ukraine in order to accuse the Russian Federation of using toxic substances during its military operations. According to reports, the evidence will be handed over to representatives of the OPCW to compile an allegedly independent report.
Well, for more, we can have our conversation be joined now by France 24 Kyiv correspondent Gulliver Cragg. General Kirillov, again, not just anybody.
No, I mean, one of the reasons that perhaps hasn't been mentioned so far in this discussion, why the Ukrainians are so pleased with this and why it's a really successful move, I think, for them, is that it's drawn attention to Russia's use of chemical weapons in this war against Ukraine, and the fact that, according to the Ukrainian side, it has increased exponentially this year. The Ukrainians were enumerating 600 cases approximately at the beginning of 2024 and now more than 4,000. And General Igor Kirillov was head of the chemical weapons department. Apparently, his role was more in developing things that could be used to frighten the West or to threaten rather than the tear gas and chloropicrin, which has been deployed in Ukraine. But he was indicted because of ultimately being the person responsible for that. And therefore, the Ukrainians, are very able to use this to draw attention to the fact that Russia is using these banned weapons pretty systematically, it seems, in its offensive in Donbass in particular.
Any comments where you are, Gulliver, on the arrest of this Uzbek citizen?
Well, what I was hearing just earlier on the radio sounded to me, but I don't want to pretend that this is any kind of official comment or anything, that the Ukrainians were taking this as face value and thinking that he genuinely had been the person that the SBU had recruited to do this deed. But I'm not sure whether officially there's been any comment on that.
So that brings us to Thursday's end-of-year presser by the Russian president, an affair that literally runs for hours. Journalists sometimes sport colorful hats. They wave signs to try to grab the attention of Vladimir Putin. In recent years, this end-of-year press conference has also been combined with phone-in calls from ordinary citizens. And we've heard from his underlings, Samantha Brenzer, so we can only imagine that Thursday he'll be obviously talking about it a lot more perhaps than what just happened in Syria.
Well, in a way, it's a welcome distraction from what's happened in Syria, because in Syria, Russia is on the verge potentially of losing its military bases which are not only important for what it was doing in Syria, but that are very important for Russia's ongoing operations in Africa. And this is a really big blow to Russia. So to be able to talk about the assassination or the killing of General Kirillov will be a way to deflect attention from a really big geostrategic disaster for Putin, which is really going to weaken him on the world stage. And it'll also allow him to continue emphasizing the need to continue the war, to not negotiate with the Ukrainians, because Putin does not want to negotiate with the Ukrainians. There's a lot of talk, and I know we're going to talk about it later in the show, about the fact that, the world is preparing for negotiations. Putin is not showing any sign of really wanting to negotiate. So this will be a way for him to express the need to continue the war, at least until Russia is able to obtain what it wants. He might actually formulate a little bit more precision what he wants. Interestingly enough, today the deputy head of the Security Council, former President Dmitry Medvedev, mentioned what he thinks Russia should do in response to the assassination of General Kirillov. And he was pointing to the fact that the British newspaper The Times had said that in times of war, Kirillov was actually a legitimate target. And so he threatened to go and take out all the Times journalists who were just sitting behind their keyboards writing this kind of thing. This is typical Medvedev talk, but we can also expect Putin to come out with what I was mentioning about Kirillov mirroring. So he will start accusing the West of doing what he's doing. He's been doing that quite a lot in the last few weeks in his public statements. He's been accusing the West of threatening the use of nuclear weapons when he's the one who's constantly threatening it. He's been accusing the West of building up armies and armaments on Russia's border and close to Ukraine. So he will do a lot of that. He will probably talk about his new prize missile, the Oreshnik, which he also can't stop talking about, which is a modified existing missile. He will probably say, oh, this is a use of a nuclear-capable missile, as if this was something really new, when in this war in Ukraine, Russia has been using nuclear-capable missiles armed with conventional warheads practically from day one. But he's building this up again, so he will probably talk about that. He'll probably also talk about mobilization, not mobilization, the autumn conscription, which has actually gone quite well, apparently, this time. However, there has been a lot of coercion, very, very violent coercion of young men to go and for the call-up, to respond to the call-up request. So he'll probably talk about that as a success, while, of course, missing to mention the fact that he needs to get 10,000 North Korean troops to retake the Russian territory that the Ukrainians have taken in the Kursk region.
Claude Blanche-Maison, is Russia weak or strong at this point, knowing that, again, we'll talk about it in a minute, but that we're in a period of interregnum in Washington?
I think Putin is rather sure of for the future, because he's quietly waiting for the 20th of January when Donald Trump will be sworn in as a new president of the United States of America.
Do you agree that he doesn't want to negotiate what Samantha was just saying?
I mean, what he wants is to have a one-to-one meeting with the man who is the president of the most powerful country in the world. He wants this photograph, and he wants to have a discussion with him. Not so much maybe on the peace in Ukraine, because he knows that his conditions are probably unacceptable for Trump, but to start a discussion over sphere of influence in Europe. I mean, I won't touch NATO countries and Atlantic Alliance, but you don't touch the countries who are near Russia, which should be under my influence, in influence scheme. And therefore, at that time, if he puts things like that, I mean, the Ukraine war seems to become a little bit anachronic in a way. It was a mean to bring this discussion one-to-one to seem to be again like, in fact, like Stalin was in Yalta. It's more or less a new schedule as it was done by Stalin. And as you know, Putin has a great admiration for Stalin, not for Lenin, but for Stalin. But in fact, he is in an old world, because the world has changed such a lot. I mean, at that time, Europe was completely done after World War II. Now we have a European Union which is rather attractive, despite all the problems of the European Union. All the countries which have a meeting today who wants to join European Union, it's something new. And the second thing is that today, after all, China is the second economy of the world. It's completely new. And China has also some idea of what should be done in Europe. So I think Putin will not achieve his goal in trying to partition Ukraine, and even more difficult to assure a kind of influence zone inside Eastern Europe.
John Hardy, do you see Donald Trump taking the meeting?
I think he very well could. President Trump, of course, famously enjoys these sort of face-to-face talks. He thinks that's how negotiations are best done, basically two people in a room. So we'll see. I think he has some good folks around him, whether it's Kellogg or Waltz, who hopefully will kind of steer policy in the right direction. I've been somewhat encouraged by the statements coming out of Trump world. I think Trump recently said he recognizes he needs to not abandon Ukraine in order to have leverage to secure a peace deal. That's good. I hope he'll kind of take that a step farther and take steps to increase Ukraine and U.S. leverage with Russia. So things like supplying more missiles, passing another Ukraine aid package through Congress so that U.S. assistance doesn't have an expiration date, tightening sanctions on Russian oil revenue. I think all these would really be helpful in sort of taking Putin down a peg. Right now, Putin thinks that his military is has the advantage in Ukraine, and for somewhat good reason. Ukraine is struggling to stabilize its lines, chiefly due to a manpower problem that may get worse in the coming months. So I think if we're going to negotiate a good and lasting deal that doesn't just kind of lead to another follow-on war, Trump will need to take steps to increase our leverage.
Donald Trump, there's sort of two ways of looking at him, right? You just mentioned it. He's got an incoming Ukraine envoy, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, you mentioned him, who's reportedly going to be traveling in the new year to Kyiv and several other European capitals on a fact-finding trip. He's not due to travel to Moscow, so perhaps that sends a signal if those reports pan out. But then there's Trump's words. Speaking earlier this week in Florida, the former and future president described both his recent trip to Paris for the reopening of Notre Dame as one where both Emmanuel Macron and Zelensky, quote, paid their respects to him before denouncing the lifting of restrictions by the US, the UK, and France on Kyiv's use of Western long-range missiles.
I don't think they should have allowed missiles to be shot 200 miles into Russia. I think that was a bad thing. And that brought the Koreans in, North Korea, another man I get along with very well. I'm the only one that does. But that did a lot of bad things. I don't think that should have been allowed.
So first off, let me ask you, Gulliver Cragg, when Ukrainians hear those words, I think you got the sequence wrong. Wasn't it first the North Korean troops going in, then the long-range missiles were allowed by Washington, London, and Paris? But
yes, I was just going to say that. That's what Biden said as his justification for why he finally decided to allow the use of those long-range missiles was he said that it was a response to the deployment of North Korean soldiers, or at least at that point, the North Korean soldiers were training somewhere in eastern Russia. They perhaps hadn't made it yet to the Kursk front line. It was clear that that was the plan.
But my question is the following. You have, on the one hand, as was just rightly described by John Hardy, quote-unquote, grown-ups who are handling national security and Ukraine, but then there's the president himself. So are Ukrainians worried or not?
Ukrainians are both worried and hopeful, I think. I mean, let's also not forget that there's a huge, wide range of different opinions in Ukraine, particularly in these very, very confusing times when no one knows what to expect. But you do hear a lot of people in Ukraine, and surveys actually bear this out, suggesting that among all European countries, the Ukrainians are the ones who've got the most confidence in Donald Trump, sort of hoping that his determination to bring an end to this, when it comes up against the realization that Vladimir Putin isn't prepared to agree to anything reasonable, will lead him in the logical sequence of events to ramp up support for Ukraine. He has sort of said as much recently. And so, that is leading people to think that maybe actually it's going to be an improvement when Donald Trump takes office. Certainly, people are expecting something to happen and they don't know what it is. People are expecting negotiations and they don't know what will come out of those negotiations. I've spoken to people who were reasonably hopeful, pointing to Russian weakness, particularly after the Syria debacle, suggesting that actually Vladimir Putin will want to agree to something reasonable, that pressure can be put on him. But then probably more people saying that that is just wishful thinking and that at the moment his soldiers have got the wind in their sails. They're advancing rapidly in Donbass. They've got every chance of retaking that little bit of Kursk region that Ukraine occupied in August. Why would he agree to any kind of peace deal? Why would he agree to what's been discussed today in Brussels, European troops potentially being sent as peacekeepers to Ukraine? And so there are certainly a hardcore of people in Ukraine who think that any kind of ceasefire deal, any kind of concession to Vladimir Putin is, absolutely to be avoided. But perhaps it won't even come to that because Putin wouldn't sit down anyway.
Yeah, I want to get to that point of European troops in a moment. But first, Samantha Brenzer, What would you say to those Ukrainians who say, well, maybe Trump can shake things up?
Well, I actually agree with that idea. I was horrified by a lot of things when Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, but he's unpredictable when it comes to his attitude towards Ukraine and Russia. He still has not actually said anything really concrete. He also said in Mar-a-Lago last week, one of the journalists asked him whether he would force Ukraine to make territorial concessions, and he didn't give a straight answer. And that is in spite of the fact that President Zelensky has also agreed to the idea of making temporary territorial concessions to have a ceasefire. Not permanent, but to sort of stop what Zelensky calls the hot phase of the war. Trump was sort of saying, well, I need to find out more. And the fact that he's now sending General Kirillov on a fact-finding mission, I think Trump is going to come into a rude awakening when he is confronted with the stubbornness of Vladimir Putin. A few weeks ago, one of Putin's close advisors, Konstantin Malafiev, gave an interview to the Financial Times in which he said, you think this negotiation is going to be just about Ukraine? It's not. It's going to be about the whole world order. It's going to be about the US sphere of influence and Russian sphere of influence. It's going to be about how far NATO is allowed or not to go to Russia's borders. Before war in Ukraine, Putin was asking NATO to withdraw to its 1997 borders. So Putin is approaching this as a negotiation with the United States about the world. The United States and Europe are approaching this as a negotiation between Russia, Ukraine, with the US and the EU about Ukraine. These are vastly different visions of what kind of negotiations will take place. And I think that when
But you heard John Hardy say that Trump would be happy to take the meeting and perhaps...
He might take a meeting. I will defer to those who are in Washington who are more in touch with what is going on there. But if he takes a meeting, he might come into a rude awakening as to how Putin is not prepared to make the kind of concessions that everyone assumes he will make. And that also includes the exact territories in Ukraine and the rest of the world. For Putin, this is a negotiation about the world and about Russia's position in the world. Ukraine is a little sort of thing on the side.
Is he entirely wrong, John Hardy? Is it a discussion about the new world order?
For Putin, I think Ukraine is kind of the central issue in this broader grievance about what the West supposedly did to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think Putin's vision is a Russia that dominates its so-called near broad, including Ukraine, and is sort of on equal footing with the West, whereas he thinks that the West basically seeks to subjugate Russia, like enlarging NATO and sort of denying Russia what Putin views as its natural right and even duty to itself and to its neighbors. So I think Ukraine is maybe the most acute piece of that bigger puzzle, but for Putin certainly it's a broader set of issues, which I think is sort of complicates the potential some of the potential proposals to kind of solve the conflict, whether it's European troops in Ukraine or what have you.
Now, we're speaking on a day when Ukraine has lost 2 more towns in the eastern Donetsk region to Russian forces. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president, in Brussels, huddling with leaders at a NATO summit a little more than 1 month out from Donald Trump's return to office in the U.S. And even if Russia hawks fear that Ukraine may be forced into a bad deal, Zelensky, who you saw here having a sidebar meeting with France's Emmanuel Macron just a short while ago, himself talking up the idea of guns going silent when he spoke on Tuesday during a visit by Poland's president to the western Ukrainian city of Lviv.
We all in Europe need not just a pause in the fighting, not just something temporary or uncertain. We need a strong common position of all partners, and we need real peace. The most important thing is that this is the kind of peace that can be achieved through strength.
Claude Blanche-Maison, two views when it comes to how to help NATO. So, how to help, Ukraine. Poland's view, make a deal, but the condition is Ukraine gets to join NATO tomorrow morning, basically. Others, well, they don't agree with that concept.
I think that Donald Trump said so many times that he would bring peace within 24 hours. Maybe, of course, he doesn't believe that he could do that in such a short time, but I think he will try something. And when he will try to bring peace, it will not be a peace treaty, of course. It will be a ceasefire, only a ceasefire. But to accept ceasefire, the conditions of Putin are probably unacceptable for Trump. And I am sure that 10 days ago, when Trump listened to Volodymyr Zelensky in Paris for the Notre Dame meeting, they had about 45 minutes together with Macron. And I don't know what was said, of course, but I suppose that Macron, who is very clever, didn't go against the will of Donald Trump to establish a ceasefire. Probably he said, you can impose a ceasefire, probably, but you cannot be the guy who lost Ukraine because you are not a loser. So you cannot be seen as the guy who has lost Ukraine.
And there's been a lot of analogies to 1938 and the famous meeting in Munich that led
Munich
to
was different. It was between Europeans.
Britain's prime minister called peace in our time.
It was between Europeans. Yalta was between between the US and the Soviet Union. Munich is quite different. It was in between Europeans. So it's not the same scheme. There we have Donald Trump and the president of Russia. And I think, I don't know what was the feeling, of course, after this meeting, but probably Trump has listened to this argument, which is a very powerful argument. You cannot be a loser. You may impose a ceasefire, but the conditions are completely
And what about
unacceptable.
France's position? Because the French have hinted that perhaps, yes, there could be French troops, I don't know if you want to call it peacekeepers or a European force that could be in there to enforce whatever's agreed upon. Poland, by the way, which was next going to hold the rotating presidency of the EU,
That's a very, very important
is
question.
against this idea. So what do you think of this concept?
That's a very important question. French troops to do what? If there is an agreement on ceasefire, of course, we have to monitor the ceasefire. Who will monitor the ceasefire? I mean, that will be in the agreement with Putin. And Putin will not accept that this ceasefire will be monitored by countries who belong to NATO. Even if it's not with a NATO announcement, after all, France, UK, Poland, are countries of NATO, and of course, I am not. If Putin accepts, okay, then we can do it. But Putin probably will not accept that those troops monitor the ceasefire. If it's to reinforce the remaining part of Ukraine and to deter a new aggression from Russia, that's another story. But there again, I mean, one of the conditions of Putin is that the rest of Ukraine should be neutralized, which means no foreign troops, and especially no troops from countries from NATO. So it depends what kind of agreement Mr. Trump is able to negotiate. And after all, I think Zelensky was very good in his argument, saying, you cannot be a loser. You have never been a loser, so you cannot be a loser on this issue.
Gulliver Cragg, your thoughts on where it's all going? Again, in the shadow of those talks that have been taking place, a dinner that's happening as we speak between some of the key European leaders with Volodymyr Zelensky.
There are a lot of reasons to criticize Volodymyr Zelensky and his government, but I think that the way he has played it on the diplomatic front since Donald Trump was elected is hard to fault him on it, really. I mean, I think that he's really doing his best to put forward the best arguments that he possibly can to try to convince Trump that he should continue to support Ukraine. And I think that's a view pretty widely shared in Ukraine, even as there is mounting criticism of Volodymyr Zelensky and his government for the failure to mobilize enough people, for disorganization in the armed forces. There are more and more reports coming in of, bad brigades, abuses by commanders, stupid mistakes being made, which could be blamed on Colonel Syrski. But it was, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky who replaced the very popular Valery Zaluzhny with Alexander Syrski. And then recently there's been a huge news story in Ukraine that probably hasn't picked up on radar of foreign media, but Yuri Boyko, a pro-Russian politician, came back to the forefront, starting a TikTok channel just after Donald Trump was elected, in which he posted messages in Russian, basically putting Russian narratives about the Russian language being banned in Ukraine, the same old stuff that the old pro-Russian parties used to do in Ukraine. And there was an outcry. He got called in to the SBU for some questioning, and he basically went away with a rap on the knuckles. And the reason for that is that Zelensky's government is actually today dependent on politicians from the former pro-Russian parties in order to pass laws. And a lot of Ukrainians are saying that's an absolutely terrible situation. So, at home, confidence in Volodymyr Zelensky is actually, falling. But at the same time, people do concede that he seems to be playing the best game he possibly can for Ukraine in all of these international diplomatic meetings and the line that he's been taking.
Samantha Brenzer, you're a former political officer at NATO. When the Ukrainian president's not in the room, what are the other NATO leaders talking about right now?
Sorry, I didn't.
What are the other NATO leaders talking? What are the NATO? Sorry, he's not a member of NATO. What are the NATO leaders talking about when Zelensky's left the room?
So the way the whole NATO-Ukraine relationship works now is that Ukraine is now a much more. Is not a member of NATO, but has a much bigger voice at the table. But when Zelensky's not in the room, they're probably talking about the fact that there's no way they're ever going to agree in the very short term for Ukraine to join NATO. There is no consensus. NATO works on a consensus basis. That means all 32 member states have to agree on anything. Every single decision is made with all member states agreeing, or else there is no decision. Something as big as enlargement, and as enlargement to Ukraine, will never get, certainly in the next few years, consensus. The United States are opposed, Germany is opposed. One can bet that Hungary's Orban is opposed, and Slovakia is probably opposed as well. These are just the most obvious candidates. So Zelensky is not going to get NATO membership for Ukraine. He's going to get bilateral guarantees. The problem is bilateral guarantees have shown again and again to not work. The only security guarantee when you oppose a nuclear-armed foe is the kind of guarantee that has some kind of nuclear umbrella in it. Now, there are examples. The United States extends its nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. What else can Ukraine do? Can Ukraine have its own bomb? That is a whole can of worms that many people would say will only make the world a lot less secure. Others would say, well, in this world where there are some countries who have a bomb and who can bully everybody, then maybe Ukraine's only real guarantee, security guarantee, would be having its own bomb, or else some kind of European deterrent. There are very, very preliminary discussions as to whether some European countries may at some point have their own nuclear deterrent. Would the French umbrella extend beyond France's borders? That is, again, a discussion which has been revived in certain sort of academic circles and political circles in France. We're very, very far away from that. So this is not going to happen in the immediate future. So things are actually, from the point of view of security guarantees from the West, the only really solid security guarantee right now would be some kind of physical presence on the ground of European troops. But again, as Ambassador Blanche-Mejean said, how, under what command, what would their mission be? We're a long way from there.
Very briefly, John Hardy, your thoughts on this concept of some kind of foreign peacekeepers, European peacekeepers?
It's an interesting concept. I think putting aside the question of whether the Kremlin would accept it, I just have some questions for the European leaders who might contribute troops. One is, what size would it be? What's the mission? The number of 40,000 troops has been thrown around. In my opinion, it'd probably have to be a bit bigger if you're taking into account unit rotations. And I question whether the European countries interested in participating could scrap together, that many combat-ready forces, bearing in mind, there are other deterrence obligations. I think the potential U.S. role is a major open question, and perhaps even the most important one. Trump has said he refuses to put troops on the ground, but could there be some sort of other, U.S. involvement, whether it's enabling capabilities or whatever? I do think a U.S. involvement will be critical if this concept is going to be, credible and a worthy deterrent of the Russians.
No getting around the United States, Gulliver Cragg.
The thing I just wanted to add to this is the way I see Volodymyr Zelensky's strategy is to make maximalist demands in order to get something less than what he is asking for in the maximalist demands. And what they actually point to is these demands, which are at once reasonable, really, in terms of the way they're argued, but obviously unrealistic, because Russia wouldn't agree, because it can't be done. What they point to in the end is, well, in order to change the situation so that that might become possible, you need to give Ukraine more weapons. The ultimate aim, really, Zelensky, what he's playing at is getting more military support, because at the moment he sees that as the only way forward for, the situation to change for Ukraine.
And here in Europe, Claude Blanche-Maison, you have the German defense minister this Wednesday stating he's going to increase the size of the military. But of course, that's just a campaign promise at this point, since they're about to have a snap election. Here in France, we don't have a budget for next year, even though we plan to ramp up our military budget. I know the likes of Denmark also are going to increase their budget, defense budget. Are the Europeans picking up the pace?
Europeans are not, of course, prepared to that kind of situation, and to come back to the negotiation or supposed negotiation that Donald Trump wants to initiate. If by chance he managed, because he's very strong, to obtain a ceasefire from Putin, this ceasefire should be the basis for a Security Council resolution, just to check that Putin doesn't put a veto on this kind of resolution, and maybe to find a solution for the troops who would be monitoring the ceasefire. Not necessarily Europeans. Could be troops coming from elsewhere. Neutral people.
All right, that's a thought that's put out there. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we'll definitely continue this discussion in the 1 month and 2 days before the inauguration of Donald Trump. Claude Blanche-Maison, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Samantha Brenzer, and I want to thank John Hardy for being with us from Washington. Gulliver Cragg, our correspondent in Kyiv. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.